start off then thinking about what is the budget. So obviously you're all here because we need to get that budget set to allow us to set the precept. Very simply, for those of you who may be here for the first time or thinking, oh my goodness, I really don't know anything about budgeting, I'm feeling really nervous, this is, you know, not a happy place for you in the same way that this might not be a happy place for me. A budget is a financial plan for a specific period of time, often a year. So if you're thinking about sort of business accounting, parish council accounting, we're talking about a year, so the 1st of April to the 31st of March. But for those of you who haven't done anything like this before, you can literally strip it back and just think about, you know, being at home, your financial position at home. What do I want to buy? What do I need to buy? Have I got enough money for those things? You know, offsetting, I've got to pay the electricity bill, the rent, you know, I want to go on holiday, and all those things. What do I want to spend it on? What do I need to spend it on? And how do I offset about that, about what I've got coming in? Okay, so just sort of thinking about those things there. So in terms of parish councils, regardless of your size, you have a statutory duty to prepare an annual budget. So no doubt that's why you're here, the focus of that, doing that today. And that budget must be prepared and approved before setting the precept and before the start of the financial year. So we've all got to focus on that, really key as well today. The last thing I've put on this slide is that all members of the council should understand the budget. So I want to have that as a bit of a theme throughout the session today, just to kind of encourage that understanding, the not necessarily even the sort of individual lines and elements of the budget, but the importance of the budget, how key it is to have a good budget, to monitor that budget. So not just thinking about we need to do the budget at this time of the year to allow us to set the precept, but actually we want to monitor it on a regular monthly basis at our meetings so we can understand the budget. We can see if we're having potential shortfalls or problems with the budget, and just getting really involved in the importance of it. A lot of the time at the end of the year, we're all focused on thinking about the year end and the AGAR being the most important part of the year for a sort of town council, because we've got to complete that AGAR and all that information from the auditor. A lot of that, though, is retrospective. We're going back and reporting on what's already happened. Here are our accounts and they all balance off, which is great. But actually, I would say setting the budget and the precept is even more important, because it's up to you and the council to set the level of public money that you're asking for to provide the services that you want to do in your area. And that's really, really important. So getting it the right level so that you've got enough to do all those things, but equally you're not taking more than you need and ending up with a surplus that you then have to work out what to do with. Okay, so I've gone into that little bit there. Why is it important? Clearly we're here mainly for setting the precept. That's our ultimate goal, but obviously we're having a good budget allows you to plan for future projects, and it also flags up potential under and overspend. So if we're monitoring that budget on a regular basis and we have a good understanding of what was going on, then it allows us to deal with things maybe before they get to a point. So if we don't look at it until the end of the year and we suddenly say, oh my goodness, we've got a large surplus or a large deficit, and we've got to then deal with it, actually if we can plan ahead for that, then it allows us to take corrective action. So the budgeting timetable then, so thinking about what we're doing and when we're doing it, it's fairly sort of rough, because hopefully you've all got your own timetable and your own meeting times set with when things are going to happen. So I've started this in October because we do this similar sort of session such as this a few times over this part of the year. So October tends to start with the starting point of thinking about that budget, particularly if you've got departments or committees. You might want to have got them hopefully starting on their element of the budget, because you've got to bring that information together with a view of November producing that full draft budget. So hopefully if you haven't already started, then you'll go away after today inspired to get going and start thinking about that first draft of that budget, with December then being your budget meeting. So obviously hopefully you've all got that scheduled in, and then that allows you then to work back in your timetable. So make sure you're giving yourself enough time to do all these things, particularly if you are needing to put different elements of budgets together. So if you've got departments and committees to give you information that you then need to put together, then obviously make sure you give them clear deadlines to allow you enough time as well. You might have reviews of the budget prior to your main meeting if you want to have a look at certain elements or different parts, things that might be changing that you want to discuss in a bit more detail, then absolutely you can do that. And then the ultimate goal is then that precept agreed and submitted to the billing authority. Now that tends to be January, but obviously you'll be governed by your specific meeting that you've got in place, and also when that billing authority wants your precept. So that's just a kind of a rough guide, but obviously if you're all here now, then you know there's the importance of getting that started. So next then, I want to talk about a couple of budgeting approaches. So just some considerations about when we start going through the process of setting the budget, how we might do that. Okay, so only a couple of things. I don't want to get too bogged down in sort of terminology and things like that. It's just sort of understanding about how we might approach setting next year's budget. The first one then is incremental budgeting. So that's a traditional method of budgeting. And as it says there, it's based on the current year and or historic data. So if you already have a good budget in place, a sound budget that's already working for you, so you like the structure, the way that it's laid out and the way that you report on it, and that works. And so far, it's giving you good information that you're able to monitor actuals versus those budgets, and the variances are sensible and there's not huge fluctuations because values are sort of in the wrong place or budgets haven't been set correctly, then there's no point in reinventing the wheel. You might as well start with what you've got already and move forward from that. So the idea of incremental budgeting then is that it adds on, or you add on a percentage or an incremental amount to that budget. At the bottom there, it says it doesn't encourage an in-depth analysis of the current budget. And that would be true if we simply took the budget and just added on a blanket 3-5%, something like that. But obviously, ideally, I'd recommend that you're doing that on a line-by-line basis. So you're thinking about those individual budget lines, and then you're thinking about, do we need to add on incremental percentage amounts individually? So you are analysing at a certain level, but if you've got a good starting point, then you might as well use that to go forward from there. The opposite end of that then is zero-based budgeting. So that is starting from scratch. You ignore everything that's gone previously. You do not consider the previous year, blank piece of paper. You're starting again. So obviously that's quite extreme, is likely to take you longer, but it may be for some of you the case. I noticed in the poll there was a few that answered yes, that the current budget wasn't fit for purpose. So it might be the way that it's structured, the way that it's laid out. Maybe it's too broad, you haven't got enough information. Maybe it's sort of spread out to loads and loads of budget lines and it's too detailed, you can't really analyze it very well. Or it might be that the individual budget lines just don't match up. The budgets have been set, but they don't seem to bear any resemblance to what actually is happening, which then in turn makes it really hard to analyze. So at that point, it might be a point to say, right, we need to start again. We're going to restructure this budget. We're going to build it back up again. So obviously you do that. You need to be really mindful of making sure you include everything, because obviously it's easy to sort of leave something out if you're building it from nothing at all. So you've got to be really mindful about that. But it does allow for that full analysis. You can think about every single element of that budget. And as it says at the bottom there, it can be useful for one-off or special projects. So it might be that your core council budget is pretty good, and therefore you can just use incremental budgeting to think about those individual elements that the structure is already there for. But you might add a new element to the budget, or you might have a specific project within a reserve. If you decide to install a play park, for example, then it's likely you're going to have to use zero-based budgeting for that sort of thing, because if you've not done it before, then obviously you're going to build that budget up based on all the things that are required to complete that project or that work. Okay, so you may find you're using a bit of a hybrid approach there, but it's just, I think, important to say that if you are finding yourself with a budget that doesn't work, and it might be that maybe it did once, it was fine, but it hasn't been updated or changed for the last 5-10 years, and the scope of the council has changed, and now is maybe the time to bite the bullet and start again. Okay, so then we can move on to forecasting. So another thing that we asked about in the poll, forecasting was a popular option answer there to something that we want to understand more about. Forecasting is really, really useful, and I would recommend that you all do a forecast for the current financial year. Okay, so forecasting is predicting the future income and expenditure to create an end-of-year position, so a financial end-of-year position to assist in budgeting. So ideally, we want to know what is going to happen with this current year against our current budget. Where is this budget going to end up to allow us to make informed decisions about our budget for next year based on what's happening in this year? Ideally, therefore, we would have our crystal ball, move on to the 31st of March and be able to create our final position, all our actuals would be in, and we could see exactly where we'd end up. We obviously don't have that luxury, and therefore we need to forecast the remaining months of the year to allow us to see what we expect to happen. So if we can see what expect to happen, we can then analyse those budget lines. Obviously, we've got some that are overspent. Does that mean next year we need to increase the budget because those overspend? Or has something unexpected happen? Was there a one-off cost in here that's not going to be repeated, and therefore we don't need to worry about that happening again next year? And it allows us to think about where we are and what needs to happen. We're going to use it in conjunction with other data. So the forecast is really, really useful, but you're likely to have other data that you're going to be using alongside it. So you might have some known things. You might have, your insurance renewal price, or you might know subscription prices that obviously you can build the budget around the known things. It does say there, if you haven't got a current year, that's not typical. So this came in initially when COVID and the sort of lockdown and the pandemic initially, and we talked about actually when we did this session back then how hard it would be to use the current year's actuals and budget to move forward to next year, because it was all the things that we expected to spend often didn't happen, and it wasn't a typical year. Now obviously that's not necessarily true for everybody here now, because we're back to sort of reasonable normality, although we have got to contend with inflation and cost of living costs and how that might pan out for next year, although they haven't hugely gone down, although last year was much worse for all of that, and we talked about that a lot last year as the cost of living crisis was really starting to hit and was a concern as we set budgets last year. But if you are finding that for you it happens to be that this year is not a normal year for you and it's hard to therefore base it upon, then you might have to use different information. You might want to go back to the prior year and use that if you've got an untypical year this year, and then be mindful of how good that information is that you're producing. It's also really, really important to say as well that ultimately we're thinking about creating a forecast to allow us to use that for next year's budget, to think about what we want to do for next year. But actually, if you produce a forecast for this year, it's really useful to take to your remaining council meetings this year to say, this is where I expect us to end against our current budget, particularly if you do a forecast and it looks like you're going to end the year with a particular surplus or a particular deficit. That may then have an impact on next year's budget. Obviously, if you're going to have a deficit and it's going to start eating into your general reserve, how do we then mitigate that next year? Do we have to put the precept up simply because our general reserve is being eaten into? Or the flip side of that, if it looks like we're going to end the year with a really large surplus, how does that then impact next year? Do we want to start thinking about some reserves or some projects, or do we want to try and offset it against next year's precept to keep the rise relatively low? But we need to be mindful of not providing massive fluctuations, because it's much better, I would say, to keep it at a fairly even level. So it's really good, alongside thinking about next year, thinking about actually what do we expect to happen for the rest of this year, and how does then that feed into next year's budget? So that's something to consider as you do that forecast as well. Moving on then, so hopefully we've all agreed that forecasting is really important and a useful element of this process. So how do we forecast? As it says at the top there, the half-year point, April to September, is a good place to start, but it can be done from any month end. Obviously now we're in November, mid-November, so hopefully you're in a position where you have got October information data into your cash book, meaning that you have good actuals for April to October, and now we want to forecast from November to March. Okay, you could use the half-year point because it's nice and simple, 6 months actual, 6-month forecast. Very simply, you could simply double what's happened already, but I would recommend you don't tend to do that, because a lot of your budget lines might not simply reflect the same thing happening in the first 6 months as the second. So obviously, again, I'd recommend you think about it line by line. Okay, but simply you're going to be predicting the remaining month's income and expenditure for each of those budget lines. And as always, in the same way that when you start thinking about setting the budget, some lines are going to be a lot easier to forecast than others. Obviously, if you've got the phone bill and you know you're paying £30 a month, simple, nice and easy, put those in for the remaining months. Other things might be much harder. So if you've got repairs, maintenance, tree works that just you can't quantify because you don't know when something's going to break or a tree's going to blow down or something needs maintaining, etc., you might just need to make your best guess there. So it might be based on what's already happened before or anything that you expect might happen. The most important thing here, though, is to be realistic. So it's slightly different in terms of a budget. So when you're thinking about setting the budget, you might be constrained about how much available funds you have to do certain things. But in forecasting, if you've committed to a goods or service and you know there's going to be a cost to pay, or something needs to be repaired, or you've got some costs that are going to take place, make sure you show them in the forecast, even if it means that you're going to end up with a line looking overspent, because you want to be realistic. And then it allows you to analyse next year's budget based on what the forecast is going to look like. So it's really important to be realistic. And if it looks like at the end of the year you're going to be overspent, then it's good to know that now, rather than it being a surprise once you get to the end of the year. Okay. Once you got that forecast, of course, you're going to analyse it against the budget. So here's a little bit of an example. This is an extract from a spreadsheet I set up about 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, before we had our additional forecasting functions on Scribe. So I had spoke to lots of clerks. They were saying we need to forecast, not really sure how to do it. So I just set something up as an example that they might want to use, and we do provide this free of charge to anyone who wants it. So we'll provide a link for that at the end as well if you did want to explore having a go with it as well. So just very simply then, on the far left hand side, we've got our code structure. So I happen to have an example of 3 sections of my budget: admin, grounds maintenance, and allotments. They're broken down into their different code levels. So each of these lines, budget lines, has got a budget. So it's all quite small numbers, but it gives you a feel for how it might work. And this is my total annual budget for 23-24, the total budget against each of these lines. Okay. Then in this example, I have got my actual, which is for April to September. So I've got 6 months worth of actuals in one column, which is shown here. And then that allows me to forecast the remaining months of October to March. Now, if you started from today and you had October actuals, you can simply populate October with what actually happened and then forecast from November to March. And if you decide to continue to forecast, which I think is a really good thing to do, each time a month end happens, you can update the column of that month with the actual. So once we get to the end of November and you've got that information, you can overtype November with what actually happened and update the remaining months for anything else that you've since known since you've last forecast. So that continues to keep forecasting to give you a feel for what might happen at the end of the year. Okay, so you complete these forecasted months for each of these lines, and as we said, some of it might be super simple because you know what you're expecting to spend. Other things might be harder, but you would then put in what you expect. That will then give you a total. So your total is the actual plus all your forecasted months. So this is our final expected end of year position. So if your forecasting is correct, this is where you're going to end up against each of these budget lines. That then gives you a variance. So if all this is true, at the end of the year, when we complete our final budget for the whole year itself, where are we going to end up? Okay, which lines are going to be overspent, underspent, etc. And then that allows us to think about next year and how that might affect things. So if we're overspent, as I said before, is that showing a trend that we therefore need to increase the budget because things are now costing more, increase the scope of what that budget covers? So we need to put up the costs, and obviously part of that you're going to have to think about inflation and the general rises anyway. Or is there something in the line that's a one-off item, an unexpected cost that won't be repeated, and therefore you don't need to worry about that significant overspend? So it allows you to think about where are we, what do we do for next year? Okay, you can see I've then got the proposed budget. So along next to that, you can then put in what you might want for next year's budget, and you can also add some comments. So I'd always recommend that you use notes, comments, annotate what you're thinking about the budget. Keep records of that, particularly if you end up changing the budget significantly for a particular line. Keep a record of it because it's really useful to have that information to refer to, particularly if you go through a process, a sort of review before you make a final decision on what that budget line might be. It's useful to have a breakdown of where all those decisions have come from. It's also really good to keep notes throughout the year of things that you know are happening or things that might be relevant to remember at the end as you get to this budget point. as a sort of memory aid when you come to it. So for example, if grass cutting is going to need to increase because we've got an additional location of next year, it's important to have records of that to make sure that you're mindful of those things as you go through the process of setting the budget. So notes are really important and really useful. And then just a quick example from Scribe as well. So you might have software, and you might have software that can forecast for you. So this is a similar sort of thing that I've just done an extract for admin. Again, I've got my budget broken down across all the months. So the months I've got, and I'm forecasting from October in this example, and you can see I've got some figures put in. So based on the settings that I've got in the system, it's forecasting for me and it's doing the same thing in terms of giving me a total and a variance, so I can start to use that. And the nice thing with software is it will naturally update as I put the data in. It'll update for the months as I go through, and I can keep working and using that, and which is really useful to continue to forecast to the end of the year as well. Okay then, so we now have a scenario where we have our forecast set created, okay, and we can think about the budget process. So along with the forecast, any relevant data, you might want to review the prior year as well. You're going to have information about certain elements. So as we said, you might know some of the costs might already be agreed that you can include, and other data that's going to be useful to you. So in terms of thinking about the budget, we're going to think about it in 3 sections. So I tend to advise that you start with expenditure, because it's the biggest element of the budget and is going to determine what level of precept you're going to need. Okay. You also need to consider any other income. So if you have other sources of income besides the precept, you need to think about where that might come from and how that's going to affect the precept that you're going to need. And you also need to think about your contingencies and reserves as well. So we'll talk about all of them in turn. Whilst you're doing all this, it's important to be mindful of the level of detail and the materiality. So just how involved you get in each of those lines. Obviously, generally, you're going to want to put more focus onto the larger budget elements. A lot of the time, that might be your staff cost, might be your biggest line in the budget. So obviously, you want to make sure that's as appropriate as possible. But anything else that's a large element of your budget, or particularly hard to budget for, then obviously you want to tend to spend time on that to get that as accurate as you can. And obviously if you've got small budgets, things like stationery, then you don't need to get too bogged down in how many pens or paper clips or whatever it is you might be, because it's just such a small element of the budget. So then, as we said, we can start with expenditure, and again I would break that down. So firstly, in expenditure, you can think about your fixed costs. So these are also your indirect costs, your overhead, so costs that are unlikely to change. So things that are generally easier to budget for and generally make a larger proportion of your budget. So things like the phone bill, if that's nice and static, then obviously that's easy to put a budget for. Things like insurance, if you've already got a renewal cost in place, or subscriptions where you know what they're going to be, or you can add a small percentage to those lines, then obviously they tend to be that bit easier. Okay. The other ones then to move on to are your reactive costs or your variable costs. So these are harder to predict, but tend, on the flip side of that, tend to make up a smaller proportion of the overall budget. So it might be things like maintenance, and as I said before, something like that is hard potentially to budget for, because you simply don't know when things are going to break or need repairing or need maintaining. Obviously you can factor in, there might be some known elements of that, so you might always do a certain level of maintenance or running repairs. You might want to consider how old the items are that you're dealing with. So have you got any plans to replace any assets that might be affected by this? And if you have just got a new asset, then maybe are you going to put down, reduce that budget line for repairs, because hopefully it's going to last better and be in better condition. Okay. And it's also important to think about relationships generally. So in the way that I've just mentioned, if you've bought a new asset, does that then affect what your repairs and maintenance budget might be, because now it doesn't need so much looking after? Anything where there's a relationship. So as it says there, related to the level of activity. So if you have a venue that you hire out, and there's obviously going to be income from that, if you're hoping that next year you might be able to push that more and get more pool hire income coming in, so you're able to hire it out more and you're going to promote it more, are you thinking therefore about the associated cost on the other side of that? So if you have more venue hire taking place. Does that then mean you're going to have increased costs in terms of lighting and heating because it's going to be in use more often? Are the cleaning costs going to increase? Are you going to need to use your caretaker more? Is there going to be a cost there? So it's important to think about, as you go through these lines on the budget, thinking about the relationships and the other sides of some of that. So if I'm going to increase that cost, does that have a knock-on effect in a different area? So think about how those relationships work and what might happen as a result of sort of increasing one budget or amending something. How does that then impact somewhere else? Okay. So then we can move on to income. And so as we said then, if you have other sources of income besides the precept, we need to consider how much that might bring in. So if it's just insignificant bit of bank interest, a few bits of sundry donations, bits and bobs, and you don't need to worry about it. But if you have other areas of income, other income sources, then we need to think about what that's going to produce for us. Again, you can break it down into that guaranteed income. So if you have something where you receive an annual rent, or you have grants that you know the value of those, then obviously they're easy to put in and incorporate into the budget. And then you're going to have those more unlikely elements of income. So uncertain sources, such as the cemetery, such as venue hire, you might be able to set a certain level that you're expecting, but it's still going to fluctuate depending on the usage that's required. Things to consider when you're doing that: are those income sources going to continue? So is there any reason why anything that might stop, or might you increase the scope? So if you were improving your building or adding a new area or room, something higher might increase or might decrease if something's going to be out of action for a while because you've got to refurbish it, for example. And also, are you changing any rates or fees? So if you're going to put up obviously the costs, is that then going to have an impact on the income coming in? So again, think about all those elements as well. Then we can think about our contingencies and our reserves as well. So we've got to factor them in and how they might move into the budget as well. So firstly, then we're thinking about amounts held for unexpected expenditure or cash flow problems. So we want to maintain our general reserve. So all councils have a general reserve to counter against unexpected things happening. And generally it's equal to between 3 and 12 months expenditure, okay, depending on how big or small you are. So if you're smaller, it will be closer to 12 months. And you're going to want to maintain it at that appropriate level. So obviously sometimes that's hard to see, and some of the fluctuations will simply be as a result of the cash flow. But you can also think about going back to that forecast where we're talking about what do we think is going to happen at the end of the current financial year. Does it look like, therefore, that our general reserve is going to be affected? You know, if we're going to have a budget deficit, then we might have a problem because we're going to have to eat into the general reserve to maintain what we need to be doing. Or if we're going to end up with a big surplus, is that then going to push our general reserve over and above the level that we should be holding? And then we need to think about how we're going to move forward with that. And as we said, we then need to think about how that might affect other reserves, or do we want to use it against the precept? It's also important to think about our contingency. So you might have a contingency reserve or budget line. Either of those is fine and sort of related to your general reserve, but you need to be mindful not to build contingencies into each budget line. It can be sort of a thing to think to want to put something in each line just in case, you know, what if this happens, what if that happens? But if you think about that, if you did that on every single budget line, it's unlikely to have a sort of what if scenario on every line. And if you did, the budget is going to be massively increased by all these potential things that could happen. So generally you want to keep it separate to that, particularly if you have one-off unexpected items that won't be repeated. Often it's better to show that on a separate line against contingency, for example, so it makes it easy to review the budget. Because if you've had something unexpected come in and you could put it against a certain line, on the face of it, you could look at that budget and think, oh my goodness, we're hugely overspent, so next year we have to increase our budget. But actually, if it's not going to be repeated and it was a one-off, then the budget might not be affected. Next year it might be perfectly suitable to keep it at a similar level as what it has already been. So it's important to think about, obviously we need to be mindful of things that might unexpectedly happen and be able to deal with that, which is where our general reserve comes in. But don't be so much to the other extent that we're very, very pessimistic about everything, because then you could end up with a precept over and above what it needs to be, and then a budget surplus that you can have to deal with. So then we can think about earmarked reserves or projects, so things that we like to do. Excuse me. So as I said, zero-based budgeting might be relevant here, particularly if it's a new project, you want to go and do something new that you've not done before, that you then have to go and find out what, what does it entail? What are those costs? What do we need to think about? Okay. So particularly if you're thinking about things like that, income, how will the project be funded? Are you going to be able to obtain a grant for it? Or do you need to put some money into the budget so that you can build up to the pot, maybe over a certain number of years, to be able to create the pot to then spend on that project? And also think about, what do we then want to expend it on? So if not only the direct cost, so if we think about that example of installing the play park, for example, we've got to think about the cost of actually doing that work. How much does it cost to prepare the area, buy the equipment, do the work, etc. But then those other associated costs. So in future years, once we've got that play park in, we need to think about having a budget for inspections, for maintenance, and then we might want to maintain a reserve for when we're thinking about replacing equipment as well. It's also useful at this point to say that reserves are really useful to help you flatline the budget as well, particularly where you have things that will repeat on a regular basis but not annually. So if we take elections, for example, or replacing your IT equipment, if you have a budget for that every year, that you have the set amount or doesn't move very much, and you put that away in the reserve pot, it then builds it up for use in the year that it takes place. So if over 5 years you have £500 going from the budget into the pot for your IT equipment, after 5 years you've got £2,500 to buy the new laptop, printer, photocopier, whatever it may be, all of those things. That's that with that. And then you continue from then to build it back up again for in 5 years' time when you're going to do the same thing. So that then means you're not having fluctuations in the budget of suddenly thinking, oh, we need to replace all these items, and then next year there isn't a cost, but we're maintaining it. So you can use reserve to help you flatline the budget and sort of spread it out more appropriately. So do consider that when you're thinking about your reserves as well. Okay, so now we've thought about that budget, we can think about calculating the precept. The final thing I just want to mention about the budget as well is, I was speaking to a lovely lady this morning and she was talking to me about her budget, and the previous clerk had set the budget including VAT. So I do also want to just mention that VAT should be excluded when you're thinking about the numbers in here. So budgets and actuals should be net values, because that's what we're comparing, because VAT is going to be reclaimed. There may be a slight cash flow element of when that VAT is coming back to you, but in terms of the budget, we're thinking about net values. Okay, so now we can think about calculating the precept. So we are going to have a scenario where we have gone through the process of working out what is our expenditure budget, what do we want to spend on our budget for payments, okay, and what have we got in terms of other expected income? Do we have any other sources of income, and what are we expecting to achieve? And also, are we thinking about any other surplus as well? So as it says there, our precept requirement is based on our expenditure and budget less our other income and or any surplus that we might be using to offset against it. So very simply then, if we think about, we've got to come up with 100k expenditure budget, but we've got a 20k income expected, therefore we need a precept of 80. So we've got our precept of 80, we've got other income of 20, gives us 100, allows us to have an expenditure budget of 100k. So really simple numbers there, but hopefully you can see the principle of how that might work. So it allows you to work out where you're coming to from all of that. So then that allows you to then look at that precept. And then once you've worked that out for what you've got for next year, then you then need to start thinking about how does it look in comparison to the current financial year? What is the increase looking like, and how does that then fit? So you therefore can check the calculation based on the equivalent bandy properties. Okay, so your billing authority or district area should give you how many equivalent bandy properties that you have, and you would simply divide the precept across that number of properties to work out the precept value per equivalent bandy property. You'd want that same information for the current year as well, so you can compare the difference of the change that is coming through. It's particularly important if you've had a large change in the number of bandy equivalent properties that you've got. So if you've had some new builds or some reclassifications, for example, that changes things a little bit, you might on the face of it have worked out a budget, a precept increase that looks quite significant, but actually across, because you've now got more properties that you're dealing with, the overall increase might not be that great. Okay, so do that to give you a bit of an understanding of what the overall impact actually is. So once you've done that, what happens if it's vastly different to last year? So the first thing to say is obviously to check it. So go through that process. You're going to create that budget and then calculate that precept. Go back through, I'm sure you're going to all do this anyway, but just review what you've done, particularly if you've got different elements coming from different areas. You want to sense check it. You want to look, have I got everything in there? Is there anything I've accidentally counted twice, or have put a number in the wrong place, or something's got, make sure, particularly if it's vastly different to what you're expecting it to be, it might simply that you've made an error. So that's the first thing, just a really important, just to say, to be mindful of just checking exactly what you've done. Okay, but then if it is vastly different, what do we want to do about it? Okay, so firstly, do we need to revisit the budget? Like the lady said at the start, if we're thinking about, hang on a minute, this precept has gone up hugely, and is it incorrect? And if it isn't incorrect, are we able to offset it? Because have we got things in that budget that we might not need? Are there ways that we can make cost savings, or have we got a lot of planned spend or projects in that actually we might have to say we're going to have to defer them because we simply can't include them in the level that we're working with at the moment? Okay. Or can we reduce the precept that we require? So are we able to offset it with a budget surplus? So actually, are we saying that we do look like we're going to have some surplus, and therefore our general reserve is going to be higher than we need to maintain it, and we might want to use it to offset that precept? Or do we need to draw down from reserves? Maybe we've got a lot held in a certain area that project might not go ahead, or we may need to rethink the scope of it, and we can use some of that. It's also really important just to think about, if we are going to try and offset it with the surplus, just about what impact that might have. So if you have a short-term surplus that you use next year simply to lessen the precept, think about what the impact might be in future years beyond that. So it's all very well thinking about, let's reduce the amount that we need to ask for the precept, but actually is it going to create fluctuations of it going down, going up? And the other thing to say as well is, when we do sessions such as this, we do have a lot of people who will come on and say, our counsellors said we're not increasing the precept, and they're quite, some of them are quite proud of the fact that the counsellors are quite proud that they're not going to increase it. They see that as a really positive thing, that the precept is stuck at that level and it's not increasing. And I just want to say that I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, because if you think about the cost of living and general inflation and cost rises and everything that goes up, and you think even about your salary's gone up, and it will continue to do so. So each time that happens, if you're not changing the level of the precept, that's less and less money you have then to put into other services. And eventually there'll become a point where it's not maintainable and you'll need to put the precept up. So actually, is it better to just do it a few % each year, than rather than have sort of 5 to 10 years of no increase and then suddenly saying, oh my goodness, we don't have enough money, we now need to put it up 15-20%. So it's just something to think about, that that's not necessarily the approach that you might just want to take. And I know that's hard sometimes, because on the face of it, you might want to be seen as not asking for more money, but is that always a good thing? So if therefore you've realized that yes, the change is justifiable and needed, so maybe the precept that you had previously simply wasn't enough, or the scope of the things that you're now doing is changing and you therefore need more, then it is necessary that you need to do that. If so, then obviously you just need to explain that. Generally, it works well to send some communication out to maybe explain exactly what's going to happen, what the overall impact is. It's good to work out the precept value per household, and maybe even per week, so that you can break it down, and often it's only sort of pounds, so that it seems a lot more appropriate and manageable level. And also explain exactly why that precept level is required. If you're not able to maintain the services, or things are going to fall by the wayside, then most of the time most residents will actually prefer to have the services provided. We had an example of one a couple of years ago where the guy said that they put the precept up because of problems in their area of traffic calming, and they had a speed sign they were putting in and some other elements in, because it was a real problem. The traffic in their village was a real issue. And actually they then communicated that, said the precept is going up because of this, and actually the response was really positive, and most people said, yes, I would like to pay more simply because I want to do something about the traffic problems that we're seeing in our parish. And it's just that consideration of, it's not necessarily always best just not do anything else and to keep the precept at the level that it always was. Okay, so just very briefly, because this is something that we put in last year when, as I mentioned before, the cost of living crisis had really taken off and inflation was a real issue. If you are finding that you might need to think about how we can reduce some costs and you want to go back to try and lessen the payment budget, just to think of some things that you can do. So reduce consumption of energy, is that you leave the lights on or some street lights or whatever it may be. Can you do something differently the way that you do that, working from home or the office, and how that's affected? Reduce office waste. So do you print out huge packs of information each time meetings come up for councillors? Could they access it on a laptop, iPad, something else, that they don't need to have reams and reams of paper all the time? More extreme, but can you defer projects or plan spending? Obviously, that might have an impact on your parish, and that might not be less good thing to do because it's going to impact the services you provide, but it might be that that's necessary. Can you review contracts or suppliers? You go for fixed price deals. Sometimes that works well because you simply know what you're going to be working with, so it makes it easier to budget. Can you invest in technology and other ways of doing things? So sometimes actually using software can save you time, so then you get some time back. Or if you've got an accountant, you might not need them if you're in financial software, whatever it may be. So some things to think about there if you do find yourself needing to reduce those costs in some way if possible. And then finally, just want to go back to monitoring the budget, because this is something that I mentioned at the start about how important it is to be mindful of the budget, to monitor the budget, to think about the budget and include everybody in that as well. So it's important to do that. Hopefully at every council meeting that you have, you'll be thinking about, this is our budget, this is our actual, this is the variance, this is where we are. This might be the areas of concern. If you've got an overspent area, what might happen about that? How can we resolve that? To allow you to monitor the budget, a good cash book is key. So ideally you want your cash book based on your budget codes and your budget lines. Okay, so I've seen many times before where somebody has a really nice budget laid out, budget lines is there, but their cash book bears no resemblance to that budget. So monitoring those two things then makes that really hard. So make sure that your cash book is fit for purpose, you keep it up to date, it allows you to produce good reporting. And as I mentioned earlier, notes on the budget is really, really helpful. So not only in terms of next year's budget, which is going to be helpful now as you go through that process. So when you get to April and you have your first budget meeting and somebody says, hang on a minute, why is that budget that level? No one can remember. And then you have argument about why that's that value. If you've got a reference to that, so actually it covers this, this, and this is what we agreed, and this is the information, it just makes life so much easier. Okay, and then the other side of that is keeping notes throughout the year. So if something happens in the year and you think that's going to impact my budget of next year, note that down now, and then I can refer to that at this time of the year, and that will help me make informed decisions and be mindful of things that might have changed. Just a quick example there as well from Scribe. This is our summary report. So allowing us, by setting that up in an appropriate way with our budget values in there, we can then monitor the budget versus the actual and the variance, and that allows us then to continually monitor that budget, think about where we are, and it just gives us a good overview for good decision making going forward. And that is everything that I wanted to cover with you today. So